thank you very much, first of all, for having me here, for the invitation, and for all the help to the organization, to Zuanni particularly. And today I will talk about social media, and what my interest is the relationship between social media and museum audiences. So how social media have kind of exploded as the Web 2.0 has exploded, how this has impacted on museums, and just as a snap of new practices in museums, I just saw Nina Simon book was probably being a turning point for the 2010s. And I'm interested in how museums use all this media, but also how the audiences use them during their visit. So visitors generated content during the museums, of which we heard a lot also yesterday. And ultimately in internet culture, so not only what visitors do during their time in the museum, but also how internet culture engage with objects, produce new objects in a way out of that, such as meme or such as social media posts, such as discussions. And these are completely new objects outside of the museum control, are actions that are performed outside of the museums by audiences, but I think they tell a lot about our culture and our contemporary knowledge. They are sources for future histories of knowledge, and that's my key point. So from a practical perspective, today I'm going to start by giving a short overview of how I see the relationship between museums and their audiences on social media. I'm going to talk about how I do digital audience research, focusing particularly on the idea of participation and expertise. And then I'm going to talk about how user-generated content feed into all these discussions and how can we look at that. And I'm going to focus on the theme of object biographies. And ultimately, I'm going to go towards the research I'm now starting, which is digital heritage as an heritage of the 21st century, which we should collect and preserve in museums. So to start with museums and their audiences, this is a very synthetic scheme of how I see the relationship of a two-way communication between the museums, in which at first the museums is just broadcasting its content, so announcing events or talking about its collections. There is then a phase in which, or some posts in which the museum engage directly with its audiences in a range of ways. And then there is what I said, visitors-generated content. So in the wild, in a way, when visitors enter in the museums, take their photos and do whatever they want with the museum digital content, also online collections and so on. And beside that, two other areas that I'm interested in is one, social media are used for professional networking by museum professionals. And as I said, the methods and the strand of research I tend towards is digital audiences research. In this case, broadcasting, I don't need to tell much about it. I define it as a museum talking about itself, its events, and its collections. Events to encourage sharing, led by the museums. I also won't talk too much about that. I just like this snapshot for the New York Times, from 2011, when there was a first influencer event in the Natural History Museum, and it was picked up by the journal as a novelty. And since then, there has been tons of influencer events, meetups, Insta swaps, social media meetings of some sort that are part now of museums' everyday practice. As part there are then special events during the year that are organized by the GLAN community, in which museums can join online and talk about themselves. Museum Self is the one in January that is coming up next week, if I remember the date correctly. And there is then Museum Week, of which I will have an example later, and Ask a Curator, and all these sort of periodical hashtags in which the community engage on social media. And lastly, there are also museums that join into trends that exist outside of the museum, such as when Pokemon Go exploded 2 years ago. Museums were tweeting, we have got Pokemons in our museums, come and catch them, help us to get rid of them. And they organized also free events for people who wanted to play with Pokemon Go in a museum spaces, so they could go into the museum for free. And these are all ways in which the museums stimulate an engagement on social media and try to engage with a range of audiences. And then there are the regularly posted, and this is just this week's story. I don't know how many of you have seen it, which was initiated by the Museum of English Rural Life in Reading, the same museums that earlier this year gave us the absolute unit, a viral tweet of a sheep, basically. And this week they started a game within museum to share photos of ducks in the collections. It literally started with this tweet, with the small duckling being ready to conquer the world, saying, "Mom, I'm ready to go on my own." And from that, they prompted an answer from other big museums, in this case, the British Museum, and it went on and on for earlier on this week. And this is other ways in which museums communicate their collection online and try to raise engagement. My question at this point is, how do the audience react? What do visitors do on their own? What is the type of visitors' content generated, which can be in a reply to hashtags launched by the museums, like find an artwork that looks like yourself or pose like an artwork, or it can be just in the wild. And in that sense, I research online audiences by using quantitative and qualitative methods. It means data mining through the social media APIs, or with R or with Python, which are the main languages used for this type of work. And then I can do quantitative analysis, or I can do thematic coding. And this is what I will show in the next example. And the scope of this analysis is to go beyond the analytics that are already present on a social media platform and think about in depth what does it mean to engage on social media, what type of reaction there are from visitors, and so on. And ultimately, it also allows an audience research that goes into looking what people think of museum. And by looking at the text, at the answers on social media, when they're positive, when they're negative, most of the cases I will show are actually quite controversial, because it is in these cases that people get more engaged with and share their opinions loudly, and it allows us to see what they expect from a museum online. And in this case, just quick notes on methodological and ethical issues. One is a matter of selections. So do we really need to collect everything? Is it even possible to do that? So probably when doing this analysis, there is always the choice of which platform do I start to analyze. And most of the case studies I will show come from Twitter. And then it's the technicality of doing the collections, the need of skills that need to be implemented in the heritage sector in order to be able to conduct in-depth analysis of this type. But also the problems of representativeness of a sample, because when collecting social media, we can set up keywords in one language, and we might miss up keywords in other languages, for example. And then API limits itself, because each social media platform has its own rule and its own limits on APIs. And finally, the big question is actually, is this ethical? Is this something it is okay to do, especially in face of all the discussion on social media mining, Cambridge Analytica, and so on? And then it is legal, and how can it be done in a legal way, in a way that is compliant with GDPR and with all the regulations of this type? And my first example now, if it goes, it's Museum Week. So Museum Week is this week in April in which every day users are encouraged to share something about their museums by using a specific hashtag. And this data come from 2016. So there are here the hashtags of the weeks, and the analysis focuses on the Sunday, which was Love Museum Week. So people were supposed to be talking why they love museums, or pictures of love scenes in their museums, and so on. And I do it focusing on Italy, partly because I was interested in seeing what was the situation in my own country, partially also because Italy tweeted a lot during that week. So this newspaper is from La Stampa, one of the major newspapers, and it says Italy stands out in the Museum Week 2016, and it was reported in all the news. So apparently, as Italians, we are great at Twitters. When I look at this graph, I actually see that, yes, we tweeted a huge lot, but the number of users is actually not so huge in comparison to other languages. And these are the languages set on the people Twitter account. So for example, I'm Italian, but my Twitter account is set in English, so I might not be caught in this graph precisely. But still, I was curious why we tweeted so much with so fewer users. Who is really tweeting? What's going on here? And so I looked at all the users. They were around 1,500, and I tried to categorize them by professional or affiliation or the level of closeness to the museum world. And the two big columns in blue are the one I couldn't actually categorize, because for the ethical issues and so on, I decided to focus only on what a user says on his Twitter bio. I wouldn't go beyond that because I felt I couldn't really Google people and go on stalking them to fit them in a category. So the not available, which is the second column, is the one in which people had a blank bio. They really hadn't anything. And the uncategorized is when the bio was a literary quote or something that didn't really help me to understand what they were doing. The other columns are categorized by affiliations, and the orange ones are the one closer to the heritage sector. So the big orange one is museum and institutions, but then I've got a museum professional from the personal accounts. I've got art history students, archaeology students, who were probably interested in starting a career in museums, so we're using this event to be noticed on social media as well. I have got art bloggers, I've got cultural association, and people who explicitly say, I'm very interested in the art sector. And if I look who tweeted the most, again, museums tweeted the most, followed by uncategorized, but then almost all the other columns are people who had a stake in the heritage sector, who were already there, a part of that. And if I look at what they talked about, that's the most surprising thing for me. The people who actually responded to the hashtag Love Museum by talking about museums were in the vast majority non-heritage professionals, while the heritage professionals were more engaged into talking to each other, professional networking activities, discussing with each other about their own profession, what they were doing, their career, but not objects in museums that had to do with love, or why they loved museums or so on. And this is a first study I did on participation, and I want to carry it on with the most recent editions of Museum Week, and for now I just published these temporary results. A different story instead is that of a spinning statuette. This is actually the case studies that got me started into this type of research, because I was doing my PhD in Manchester on public perception of archaeology, and this happened in the archaeological collection of a museum. And it was a video of a statuette moving apparently of its own accord in the museum case. And the museum shared it through a press release on the blog and on social media by saying it could be vibration, but we are not really sure. And this kind of caught the interest of the people. You can see the video has had more than 5 million views, and at the time I collected the data, and I had this more than 15,000 tweets. I had a newspaper article from all over the world, and blogs, YouTube videos, YouTube responses, and I had comments below newspaper articles on that, not from all the newspapers, but only from a selections. And here I can show also from the geographical analysis what I mean that I had, when I say the choice of keywords, it's important because I had set my keyword to English, and then I quickly realized that in Italian we don't say Manchester Museum, we say Museo di Manchester. In French as well, it's Musée de Manchester. And so I added Italian and French keywords, for example. I don't know Chinese and Arabic, so I'm missing probably a lot of content from these areas, because I couldn't catch it. And this is the timeline of these tweets, and it shows how quickly it went viral over a weekend with over 10,000 tweets in the weekend after it was released. And when I say quantitative analysis, Other type of data I can look at are, for example, how do people interact? Do they come from a website? Do they come from an app? And this is important when they're sharing news articles, because if I see that they are, for example, not in this one on the hardware, but in the one in where they're coming from, if I see they come from Twitter and they just retweet someone else, it doesn't tell me they've really clicked on the link and read the article. Instead, if I focus if I come from the newspaper and they clicked on the share with Twitter button, it gives me a different code, and I can say they really read the article and then chose to share it. And this way I can also calculate which were the most shared on Twitter articles and compare this, for example, with which ones were the ones that were most commented online, and see what type of, where do people get the information and how this affects the reaction. And then, as I mentioned before, I did a qualitative analysis, and for that I used a coding system. One of my categories was popular culture, and this is a sample of the references to popular culture in response to an Egyptian statuette in an English museum moving of its own. So I wouldn't have immediately thought of Harry Potter. I wouldn't have immediately tweeted that there is an Horcrux in the Manchester Museum. But this just gave me an idea of what sort of response people have. And coming from an archaeological background as well, archaeologists are often worried that their theories are misinterpreted by the wider public. And this kind of content instead shows that the public is aware that one thing is more archaeological theory and popular culture is more a kind of an internet phenomenon of sharing things within jokes and so on, rather than something that really affects the knowledge process. Instead, there were more longer comments. These come from newspaper comments and forums that were a bit more detailed, and so led me to understand better what people really think, not only of this statuette, but also of important museum topics like human remains and repatriation. Because one of these comments, the second one, basically says we should send the statuette back to Egypt. So it's one that would, at first, would look like doing an argument for repatriation. And, but reading it, it says we should send it to Egypt so they deal with the curse. And this is something that wouldn't come out so easily in a survey on what do you think of museum repatriation or so on. And it was another way of looking at these issues and understanding how the data mining can lead to a better insights into the public. And this also led me to my new theoretical strands in my work, which is object biographies, because this is not only more about evaluating audiences or understanding online audiences and their participations, but it's also about all these phenomena add a new step, a new layer in the history of the objects. And so what I'm trying to look now is how this kind of controversial phenomena, how the online life of the objects can be included in an object biography. And object biographies in a digital age pose us the question like, is this a good method? Is this something that is worth pursuing? How can we do it again? And how do we visualize that? How do we visualize that? Because we can add it in a publication, but it's also in a museum system. How can we add this object has been shared on Twitter with this comment, or this object has been at the center of this online storm, and this is something that has become part of its life. And by that, looking at controversial objects is usually the easiest way to catch a lot of data. So some of the case studies I'm looking at is this one from the Manchester Art Gallery, when they did a performance. Sonia Boyce did a performance last year, in which they also first removed and then prompted a debate on these paintings in the wake of the Me Too movement. And it went again pretty viral, and it had posts from all over the world as well, if we look at the coding, at the language. And again, how can we analyze and preserve this response? Similarly, this is one from the Louvre. And when France won the World Cup this summer, the Louvre sent out this tweet from its official account. And this provoked huge reactions, especially in Italy, because, of course, we want Mona Lisa back. And basically, this is the number of tweets mentioning the Louvre account in the month following the end of the World Cup. And so you can see the proportion of tweets in response to this Mona Lisa tweet in comparison to all the others. And this is by language, and the top language is actually Italian. The second one is French. And these are like keywords that were shared. So through text mining the tweets, I can find keywords that were used. And here some of them do not really make sense a lot because I haven't finished to really clean all the data. Some of them are name of the players. Sometimes we see Leonardo appearing, or there was also Buffon appearing in one of these graphs because it was the same time that Italy goalkeeper had moved to France. So one of the arguments from the Italian was like, it doesn't mean that our best goalkeeper moved to Paris Saint-Germain. He becomes the goalkeeper of the French national team, and that should be the same for Mona Lisa, should stay Italian. And so these were some of the answers also. And it got so much out of proportion that the Louvre had to tweet in Italian to specify that the Gioconda had actually been given by Leonardo to the French king. So it had not been stolen by Napoleon or someone else in later times. But by mining this sort of controversy, I can see that like Italians definitely have strong feeling about this painting. And they have strong feeling about restitution when it comes to this one. And so it's a way of looking at how people are really interacting with museums this way. And I can go behind the museum as well. So I can look at user-led events, what I call them now, which means people who just start to talk about heritage institutions without being prompted by a museum or the institution itself. And my case studies in this case is the Cathedrals World Cup, which happened actually in November 2017. It was prompted by this user who noticed that English cathedrals are 48, so they fit into the World Cup schema of how many teams take part in a World Cup. So why don't we do a Cathedrals World Cup by Twitter polls? And this is the final between Lincoln, York, Durham, and Bristol. The winner was Lincoln. And this just started as a Twitter joke by a user. Our user noticed it, started to take part into it. But then it was picked up by the cathedral themselves. So these are still tweets from the user who was comparing features of the various cathedrals at each round, so to help people decide who they would vote for. And these are the cathedrals when they started to take part in the finalists and to call their supporters, also with different languages and tones, which are also interesting to use, because Durham went with I've Got Famous Friends, Marvel was filmed here, Bristol went with Meme Game, York went with Landscape, and Lincoln went with architectonic details. So it's interesting to see not only they joined in, but how they choose to kind of promote themselves in this competition. And then it was picked up by the media. This is the BBC one, and the other one is the local BBC radio from York, which talks about the controversy, because in the final, actually, York and Lincoln had the same amount, the same percentage of votes, but Lincoln had a few more, and that was a controversy picked up by the media. There were memes done out of that. And this is an in-joke, because Bristol Cathedral is actually much more modern than all the other ones. And there were people who commented after the event that this has prompted them to go and visit more places. And there was also a celebration, a physical celebration in the Lincoln Cathedral. So once they won, it just didn't remain a Twitter joke or a Twitter game, but it went back to the institution, and they held like a special event just to celebrate the victory in the Cathedrals World Cup. And so basically these are all ways of seeing how museums start to prompt reaction on social media, how users develop their own topics and their own threads. And by analyzing this, I can look at participation issues, I can look what users expect from a museum and what they criticize instead, and what they think of museum topics such as human remains or restitution. And by looking at this data, I also have to think that given the limitation of the API or the kind of short life of certain platform, because we think social media has always been there and it is only little more than 10 years, 13 years or so. So it's like, how can we actually preserve this as a moment in our culture? How can we go towards digital preservation strategies also for this content, so that in the future, when Twitter won't be there anymore, Facebook won't be there anymore, or there will be new platforms, we can still look at what people did in the 2010 to engage with heritage, and how did they, what was the knowledge and the understanding of museums and heritage in this period. And furthermore, it's not only about understanding of heritage, but it's also that our life and our cultures takes place in internet, takes place online. And so this is another argument for preserving it as contemporary heritage. And there are a few museums who have started to look at how to collect social media. But the best example I have comes from a North American comedy program, satirical program from Comedy Central, which last year did a pop-up museums of Donald Trump tweets in New York. And the Trump Presidential Twitter Library from this pop-up museums in New York went on touring North America. It has been in around 5 or 6 cities. And there is a virtual tour which is available through Comedy Central. And now they have just published this autumn also an exhibition book out of that. So basically what I started by looking at participation, evaluation issues. I moved towards object biography. And what I'm interested at looking in now is also how do I go further. So instead of talking about conclusion, I will just say what I aim to do in the next years, which is to develop better methods and strategies for the collection and analytics of this data, understanding better their values in terms of evaluations, and how can they work as where are the benchmarks in using this data as evaluations, and sources for contemporary history, which means thinking about digital preservation strategies, collection strategies, and way of visualizing this data, and ultimately integrate them with the objects also in the museum space, online, physical and online space. So it means how do we integrate them on a museum online collection site? Can we do that? And how do we integrate them in an exhibition? If we are to do an exhibition about something that happened 3 years ago, how can we display the objects and the material heritage of this exhibition and its digital heritage together? And so that's basically where I plan to go now with my habilitations, and I will update in due time. So thank you for...